Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us from Europe. My name is Simon Ng, BEC's Director of Policy and Research. A warm welcome to BEC EnviroSeries Online Conference, Urban Transport on the Move, Connecting Policy, People, and Business Opportunities. This is the fourth and final session of the day, and the focus is promoting active and inclusive transport. Now, on behalf of BEC, I would like to thank our participants, supporting organizations, and most important of all, our sponsors, including CLP Power Hong Kong Limited, MTR Corporation, Shell Hong Kong Limited, the Hong Kong Electric Company Limited, and the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Now, it's my pleasure to invite our first speaker, Ms. Bronwen Thornton, CEO of Walk21. Walk21 was set up in year 2000 by Mr. Jim Walker as he organized the first international conference dedicated to walking and walkability in London. And since then, they organize annually an international conference around the world to promote walking and walkability. And they are still at the forefront of this particular pathway. So please welcome Bronwen.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's a delight to be talking at your event here in Hong Kong. We held our Walk21 conference in Hong Kong a number of years ago and have been, which was absolutely fantastic. It's an amazing city. And we've been working with the city since then as well to build on the foundation that they have for great walkability and make it even better. So my presentation today is going to be about COVID and walkability, because how can we not be talking about it as I'm sitting here in the UK. We're going back into tight restrictions on not only our socializing, but our movement, and our cities all over the world this year have had to respond to this pandemic challenge. Okay, now my slide isn't changing. Just give me one moment to see why. There we are. Great. So these are some images from cities that will look very familiar to all of us in some capacity. Cities before and during the biggest crisis in COVID. Streets that were jammed with traffic, empty of vehicles, and starting to, and very often empty of people as well. But this whole sort of city shut down, public space, certainly the amount of public space we dedicate to our streets is revealed. So these are very familiar images that we have been seeing around the world as cities cope with COVID-19. Some of the responses that these cities have made in response for walking and to enable people to walk, because are the slides? I'm not sure what you can see now, because what I can see on my screen is different from what is on your screen. Can organizers, are you using the presentation I gave you, or are you using my slides? Because I did make a couple of changes. Okay, thank you. That's it, thank you. So what happened in cities, they had to make it safe for people to continue moving because people still needed to move. And we saw a few really sort of iconic things come into the streets. And here in Australia, you could see that they stopped requiring pedestrians to ask permission to cross the road, took away the push buttons for that. They introduced, in Brussels, they introduced one-way systems for movement in the streets. People came out, occupied the streets, and were asked to stay 2 meters apart. All over the world, people still needed to come onto the streets and access them, not only for for shopping, but also for exercise opportunities. And you can see in this image here, a range of cities and around the world were different, that it was a very global phenomenon, this need to use our streets and public spaces differently from how they had been dedicated to vehicle movement. From Wuhan through Madrid, in Kampala, and right down to my town, which is Cheltenham in the bottom corner, where the roadworks divisions became enablers of pedestrian space. And what was really interesting, though, when communities were asked to stay at home, was in suburban areas, and this is an example from Cape Town in South Africa, and you can see the urban sprawl in the image on the screen, is that people had no access to local food and local shops and opportunities. And so the government actually allowed food vans to come into communities to enable people to access their local shops and services. They didn't have sufficient local shops and services. And so therefore the food vans had to come in. And in the image in the bottom, you can see these are people queuing, waiting to get into the supermarket. So the impact of COVID was not just about how we move, but how we actually function and manage in our daily lives. And I'm going to share some examples from Africa. I know it's a long way from Hong Kong, but it's an important thing to look, because we looked at not only was how was COVID changing the way we behaved in our cities, but was it changing the way we think about our cities? And this is what we're really interested in at Walk 21, is has the pandemic had any impact on how we think about walking and what the opportunity is to improve conditions for walking and walkability in our cities? And we ran this survey across African nations to find out not only what they were doing, because very few people were looking, but also to find out what they were thinking about COVID. And what's interesting in an African context is that about 70% of mode share in African cities is walking. Hong Kong, as you probably all know, has a 90% walking public transport mode share. It's always the iconic city for this issue in the world. But in Africa, it also has very high levels of walking, but it's not something they necessarily want. They are definitely desperate to motorize and to change that and not to recognize the value of walking in those communities, which was very much part of why we were doing this survey. And what we found was that only 20% of cities were actually taking any action to make it safer to walk or cycle during COVID-19, despite these levels. But what was being done was very interesting to us and predictable in terms of the things that were being done all around the world. So they were encouraging people to walk more. They were bringing in traffic restrictions, widening footpaths, improving crossings, and permitting vending on local streets, as I talked about earlier. Cycling in Africa is a very small percentage, but they're also bringing in those opportunities in some of the cities because it's seen very much as an enabler for those longer distance journeys. And what the great news was from this survey was that 93% of our respondents acknowledged that the pandemic had opened their eyes to the importance of walkability in our communities and confirmed that they wanted to do more to support the needs of walking and cycling in the future. So it had alerted them to the importance of it. And in fact, just before we started, we were talking about resilience. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because that example from Cape Town is exactly that. We don't build resilience into our cities if we only build for motor vehicles. The mortgage crisis in North America, all those vast suburban landscapes were devastated because people could no longer access what they needed to because they couldn't afford to live there and afford the transport costs. We must think about the impact of the way we've been building our cities. And this showed that people were willing in this African community, and we were surveying people inside governments, they were willing to recognize the importance of investing in walking and cycling. So what did happen as a result? And this is the good news. And this is actually one of the critical things that the pandemic has done. And we see this not just in Africa, and I'm going to show a number of examples. It actually accelerated change. Those cities that had the potential to make change or had the plans on the shelf already were able to use the pandemic as a catalyst to take action. So Nairobi, for example, has started improving its walking and cycling infrastructure within the CBD and extending that out. Now, Nairobi's had a policy on the books for a number of years to invest 20% of their transport budget into walking and cycling, but nobody activated it. The policy was there, but nobody was doing anything about it. And then come the pandemic and the need, they were able to move very quickly and say, right, we've got the lever, we can take action, and to start implementing those. Also in Africa during the pandemic, Ethiopia launched its new strategy for walking and cycling. And they weren't going to be I know Ethiopia is now in a very sticky situation nationally with conflict, but within this year, they're taking a very proactive approach and using the pandemic to really progress the agenda. And we're seeing this in cities in all sorts of different economic and political contexts. Now, this is probably the more famous one of that, which is Milan. And Milan, again, had been working for quite a while on looking at how they could reimagine their streets and make them better for walking and cycling. And so you can see in the pictures here, the transition of a city from being a road which is fully dedicated to vehicles, the planning that they put in place for improving walking and cycling, painting those lines on the road during the pandemic, and then enabling people to come out and enjoy. Again, Milan was already working on this agenda. The pandemic enabled them to lift off and move forward more quickly. London is another fantastic example of this. I know the London story particularly well. I used to live there, and we've got a long history of working with the City of London. The City of London, the whole of the London metropolis, was able to start to move on walking and cycling initiatives because they've had these plans on the shelf for 20 years. They know the streets that need to be transformed. They just need a bit of political capital and community motivation to do it. And particularly in the City of London, which has incredibly high levels of walking, and they're reducing their traffic levels all the time. You can see here this map of the broader area of London and the lines and the roads where they're going to change the walking and cycling. And then from that, the box in the middle is the actual core, the financial district of London. That's the City of London and the intensification of those plans. And the images below show Regent Street, which is an extraordinarily usually busy shopping street, absolutely empty during COVID. The second image you see there is the bicycles in Bank Junction. And this is where the city has taken, it's a 5-way junction in the heart of the financial district, and they've taken traffic out. The transformation of that junction is extraordinary. The quiet, the comfort that you experience there now is amazing. And then further out in London, a lot of road closures to traffic to enable, as you can see here, filtered movement with walking and cycling. This hasn't been without its controversy in London. Let's make no mistake. There's been extraordinary sort of kickback, inevitably, of these experiences. But the low traffic neighborhoods, as they're called, are being measured now, and the impact is positive. People are experiencing them and finding the value that they can in them and appreciating what the council's done. It's not always that great. Berlin, they're taking out some of the bike lanes. Sometimes things done in a rush without the community need time to be sort of more embedded in the community, but we must take these opportunities to make those first steps. And I just want to share some other examples that particularly warm my heart around how cities have been responding. And this is a city in India. You can see how it was before. And after the COVID, they've reclaimed that space and created public space. Cities like Bristol in the top image here, I love this. They created space in the parks. They drew hearts on the grass so people could put in their social bubbles. Our public space has to be thought about differently, but we have to enable people to come back. And on the bottom there, you can see the yellow circles to define the spaces where people can mix. But people are responding to this reallocation of space. Cafes are spilling out into the roadways, into what used to be car parking, and people are building urban gardens. We talked earlier about the need for food, localization of services. As more people work from home, which has been another feature of the pandemic, the localization of movement will have to change the way we think about how we look after our cities. It won't be this focus on the heavy commute in and out of town, but more local neighborhoods, local networks, as people work from home and need to come out and exercise and access local services. So just quickly, I know a lot of those images that I've shared don't resonate in the intensity, high density cities of Hong Kong. I really appreciate that the challenges you have are often very different. You can't achieve the same even ambition around perhaps social distancing that other cities can, because you simply don't have the space. But a lot can be done to change the way that cities think about their spaces and allocate it according to walking, cycling, how we move, how we travel. And it might be easy to think that with Hong Kong, because you already have such high levels of walking, you have very good transit-oriented development, but you also have increasing vehicle motorization, and you have increasing allocation of road space to vehicles. And lots of the spaces in Hong Kong are hostile to pedestrian movement and can enable people to walk more comfortably locally. And we've been looking at this with the Hong Kong government, working for the last few years, as I said, since our conference, at ways that Hong Kong can make even more of it more walkable, but more walkable locally, not just to access transit to go somewhere else in the city, but to live within that city as well. Other cities and countries around the world are really responding, stepping up for walking and walkability. The government of Ireland, the new government of Ireland, is allocating 20% of its national transport budget to active travel. And they're actually splitting it 10% for cycling and 10% for walking. That's €1 million a day to encourage walking across Ireland. That is fantastic money. And imagine the impact we can have with that and the commitment. And Dublin is planning increasing in walking. We have to back up our investments. We're seeing some of this investment and this commitment at national level. The UK did it. New Zealand came in with recovery packages to support walking and cycling. But Dublin has done it as a long-term commitment. Rotterdam, everyone thinks of the Netherlands as a cycling city, the Netherlands as a cycling country and Rotterdam as a cycling city, but they have just released a fantastic walking strategy, and the country is developing a national walking strategy because they realize that building a cycling city doesn't build a great walking city. And in fact, the imbalance there, cycling is having a negative impact on walking in the same way that motor traffic can have a negative impact on walking. So these are great to see, these cities that are already very good for walking and doing more and investing in it as a mode. And if you've been paying attention to road safety news, of course, Oslo and Helsinki have committed to Vision Zero and invested in walkability and traffic management and delivered no pedestrian fatalities in the city last year. That is Vision Zero in action, and it proves that it's possible, and we must make those commitments to make it safer for people. Seoul Metropolitan Government, which started their walkability agenda from a road safety imperative, is now working towards making it much nicer as well, with ambitious walking plans to create a network of greenways and riverside parks across the city. And the new mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, was the famous mayor of Bogota, but the new mayor of Bogota, her stated commitment is to transform the walking experience in that city. Better walkable streets, better public transport to enable that to be an even better walkable city. So that's it from me. Once again, thank you for that. I think there's some really critical comments and lessons for Hong Kong, and the things that I would really like to summarize is, we must continue to invest in walkability. It doesn't just happen overnight, and it doesn't just stay as it doesn't just exist continually. We have to maintain those spaces. We have to make them nice and attractive and safe for people. We have to ensure the resilience of our cities so that people can access everything locally and move locally. And we have to continue to support people to make that choice as they move around. And the benefits, I'm sure you will hear from the other speakers this morning, and we can discuss in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bronwen, for your sharing. And it's so nice that you mentioned the Walk 21 Hong Kong conference in 2016. I still remember the first time I met you in Bali. I think it's in 2013, when my vision was actually invite you and Jim to Hong Kong to start promoting walkability and to bring the Walk 21 conference to Hong Kong. And of course, it happened in 2016, being the first Asian city to host that conference. So that's history, but I think that's kind of laid the foundation for a lot more discussion on walkability in Hong Kong. And you also mentioned, government putting together a study on walkability that started, I think, 3 years ago, and is still ongoing. So, maybe during the panel discussion session, I'm going to ask you a bit more about the study, and also, what you have learned from Hong Kong, because you've got so much experience from other parts of the world. But Hong Kong, being a high-density city with so many people and vehicles, must have given you a lot of thinking. Okay, now let me introduce our next speaker, Professor Billie Giles-Corti. Professor Giles-Corti is a distinguished professor at the RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. And she's going to talk about creating healthy and sustainable cities with active and inclusive transport. Billie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak, and welcome everyone. And it's wonderful to be here and to be sharing the panel with Bronwen. Today I'm going to be talking about creating healthy, livable cities and with active and inclusive transport, and it's really going beyond aspirations to delivery on the ground. Now, some of this for Hong Kong may or may not be relevant. I'm going to be sharing with you results from Melbourne. But I think the lessons from what we've done, what we've learned in Melbourne and in Australia, indeed, could be very relevant to your aspiration to encourage active transport and to have inclusiveness in the way you design things. Because the decisions that we make, we might have aspirations, but to deliver on the ground does require, real commitment and real investment. Now, this is not just an idea that we've come up with, and we're particularly interested in the health impacts, but now it's a global trend. The UN Sustainable Development Goals talk specifically about the need for city planning to be part of the global agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there's around 9 goals and 24 targets that talk around that are to do with city planning and health. So this is not just a pie in the sky idea. It's really becoming mainstream and so important. And it ties very nicely to the World Health Organization, which is talking about this global recognition about the need for healthy, active cities, the need to create the environments that support people to be active, not just to encourage people to be active and to have communication campaigns, but also to create the environments that support people, create the active systems that support people. So it's really critical that we go beyond aspiration to really putting in place the mechanisms through which we can achieve these things. Now, I also want to make the point that creating healthy and sustainable cities that encourage active and inclusive transport is really the pathway to creating a livable city. And in Melbourne, we've been conceiving what the concept of livability is. Everyone talks about livability. Not many people define it, and even fewer measure it. You may have seen the UN Sustainable Development the Economist Intelligence Unit. They talk about livability and they measure. They put out a score every year. Melbourne, as you may know, has been one of the most livable cities for 7 years. It's been now pipped at the post by Vienna, much to everyone's horror, I must say, in Melbourne. But what's interesting about the Economist Intelligence use to thinking about livability, it really is an index that tells companies whether or not they should pay a loading to their globe-trotting executives when they get relocated to a city. That's really its purpose. And it tells you nothing about the lived experience of people living in a city. It tells you about whether, from an executive's point of view, whether it's going to have good weather, whether it's going to be comfortable for travel, whether there's high quality schools, that sort of thing. So if you're thinking of moving around the world as an executive, check out the Economist Intelligence Unit, and it'll tell you, if you're a highly paid worker, where best to go and where you won't get a loading. But if you're really wanting to look at the livability of a city for the lived experience of people who live in a city, it doesn't tell you anything about that. And that's what we've been trying to do. And it's something that you may be able to apply equally in your city and in Hong Kong. So what we looked at livability, we defined it, and it ties nicely to the theme of this session. It's got to be safe, socially cohesive, but it's also got to be inclusive. That's a good livable place, a city or a community. It has to be environmentally sustainable. We have a global climate crisis on our hands. We experienced that very severely last year in Australia. So this is not a dress rehearsal. It's happening on our watch. The climate is changing, And we need to do something about that to contribute what we can to create a more sustainable, climate-friendly globe. And that includes active transport. Yes, we need affordable housing, but what concerns me in the way we tackle affordable housing, I don't know if it's the same in Hong Kong or certainly in Australia, we put all the affordable housing out on the fringe of our cities, and it's disconnected to everything you need for daily living. It's disconnected to public transport, walking and cycling infrastructure, to employment, and all the things you need for daily living. So shops, services, leisure and culture, these are really critical. And I want to show you what it actually looks like in Australia. We took the view that and we have done some work now globally in 25 cities. We're hoping to release this next year, similar sorts of measures, 25 cities across the globe. It does include Hong Kong, actually. And we took the view that what gets measured gets done. And we needed to move beyond aspiration to actually benchmarking and monitoring what gets delivered on the ground for the people who live in cities. That's really what we've been doing. And you may find this of interest in different sorts of measures, but nevertheless of interest in Hong Kong. So for example, we measured walkability. I'm going to come to this in a minute, and I'll explain to you what the patterns mean. So in terms of walkability, this is what it looks like in Melbourne. Anything green, especially the darker green, is good, and anything pink is really bad. And so I really am reluctant to tell you this because you may be someone who aspires to come to Melbourne, but I have to tell you that this is what the pattern looks like. Melbourne is very livable when you live in the inner city, where it's most expensive, where it's not got the most affordable housing. But once you move out to the fringe of the city, you start to see very low levels of walkability. You would expect to see very few people walking for transport out here. You maybe see people walking for recreation, but very few people walking for transport. And if we want a more sustainable city, people need to walk for transport. Now, why is that the case? Well, this will be very different to you in Hong Kong. But what we found is we looked at, well, how far do people have to walk if they want to get to an activity centre with a supermarket? And we found that in Melbourne, they have to walk around 1,300 metres to get to a supermarket. In Sydney, in Perth, it's almost 1.6 kilometres to get to a supermarket, to walk to a supermarket. And then we will look at the densities, and then you'll be horrified when you see this. It's just how low our densities are. You know, Melbourne, we build at around 14 dwellings per hectare. Sydney, 18 dwellings per hectare. To be honest, these are 2017 results, gone up a little bit since then. But our research shows that if we really want to encourage walking, and I'm sure Hong Kong is very different, covers this, you need to be within 800 metres of an activity centre. People will walk that far. And we need to get up to at least 25 to 30 dwellings per hectare. Now, the reason I'm showing you these results for Hong Kong is you will have different issues, but the same thing applies, that you could be using metrics to actually understand the city, to create the city that you really want. When we looked at social infrastructure includes things like, you know, doctor surgeries, it includes schools, it includes all the things you need for daily living, community centres, and they provide destinations for people to walk. It also provides local employment. And we looked at the distribution across the city of the same sorts of things, and we saw a similar pattern. It's fantastic if you live in inner Melbourne. But once you start to get out on the fringe of the city, very poor access to all these things. And they're the destinations that people can walk to. So again, important, you know, depending on what your aspirations are for your city, mapping this and showing the distribution and where the inequities are means that you're creating a city for all, not just for the ones who are fortunate to live in the best areas. So important. Public transport. This is an interesting little graph because what we looked at, we wanted to evaluate the quality of the implementation of policy in Victoria or Australia actually. And what we looked at is the percentage of suburbs that are meeting the state's transport policy. And the state's transport policy is that 95% of people should live within 400 metres of a public transport stop, 400 metres of a bus stop, 600 metres of a tram stop, or 800 metres of a train stop. That's the policy. And these are the suburbs that meet that policy. Now, what this shows is that, again, if you live in the inner city, 95% of people have this sort of level of access. But look at the rest of the city. They have very poor access. So actually monitoring and benchmarking policy against what gets delivered on the ground is a very powerful thing. 14% of suburbs meet the policy. We also then looked at, well, it's all very well to have a policy around distance to a public transport stop, but what about services, regular services? And what we found was that it's really, again, only in the inner city that people are actually got public transport stop within 400 metres and services within 30 minutes. People, again, on the fringe, a very different pattern. Very, very few people, out here, look, less than 12% are actually achieving this. So if you want equity, if you want an inclusive city, looking across the entire city at access to things is very important, because it's easy to delude oneself that we're delivering the cities that we desire when it's only the ones who are in the best suburbs, in the most inner city suburbs, that are getting those services. Around 36% of people in Melbourne have a bus stop within 400 metres and a service every 30 minutes. So again, if you're coming to Melbourne, try and live in the inner city, because that's going to give you the best opportunity for public transport and all the services. It's interesting as well, about local employment, because if people live locally, we've seen with COVID just how important that is. If people can live and work in their same suburb, it's so much easier than having to get onto public transport, which is a challenge in this current environment. And what we found was that 28% of people in Melbourne live and work in the same area. And so the same sort of suburbs, sort of not in their neighbourhood, but the same area. So it's a walking or cycling distance. But when we look at the number of people who get to work by active transport, only 5% of people in Melbourne do that, and 16% use public transport. The rest drive. So we have a dreadful situation in Melbourne, very different to what you have in Hong Kong, but we have similar patterns across the whole of the country, actually. Sydney has the best results for public transport, but you can see we have very low levels for active transport to work. Now that, again, looking at data like this gives you a clue about where to put your effort. In your own case, most of your trips are by walking and cycling, so that may not be the issue. What becomes the issue then is putting the policies in place to create the safer environment, the easier environment for people to navigate. So again, it's about knowing the city, knowing your metrics, and then coming up with the policies that are going to get you to where you need. We've also looked at this concept of livability. We pulled together all of our indicators of livability, and we created an index. This is work done by one of my colleagues, Carl Higgs. And again, you see a similar pattern, because a walkable environment, one that's got good connected street networks, enough density in shops and services, that underpins a livable city. Getting that right, and you almost on the pathway to a livable city. What we see here is a similar pattern, that it's the inner city of Melbourne, some of the inner city, early middle level suburbs that get it, but once you get out in the fringe, they're not livable in terms of a healthy, livable environment, a sustainable environment where people can walk. What we found is this is important, because with every unit increase in livability, the likelihood of people walking increases, walking, cycling, or using public transport increases by about 10 to 15%, and the odds of driving decrease by about 12%. So living in an environment that has connected street networks, has shops and services nearby, has density is not such an issue for you, but with all the things that the amenities that you can walk to, increases walking, cycling, and public transport, and decreases driving. So how do we go from aspiration to delivery on the ground? And you'll have your own challenges that you need to deal with in Hong Kong. But what we've concluded is that what happens in cities is they don't have evidence-informed policy. They don't have the evidence to inform what they do. And as a result of that, they create policies that don't necessarily achieve the best cities. So what we've said is there's a real need for evidence-informed policies. So a job here for the academics who are listening today, but also a job here for the policymakers in the city to look to evidence to inform the policies so that we actually produce the cities that we want. Now, it's not easy to transform a city, let's face it. It takes time, but we need aspirational goals. We need big goals, big targets. We found that some cities in Australia have very low targets, and that means that they look good because they're achieving their targets, but they're not very ambitious. We think that needs to be ambitious targets to produce the cities that we need and want. we need to have short, medium, long-term targets to achieve those. So it might be that in the short term we don't achieve them initially, but we want to have a hard target with a short, medium, long-term target to achieve the cities that we need. And we would recommend that people start to use more of these spatial indicators that can be used to benchmark and monitor cities, because we think that this is really important, and also to benchmark the policies that are being implemented to see who are the winners and losers in a city. Where's the hidden city? And where do we have problems that we need to be thinking about, where we could put interventions that will make it a sustainable and healthy city for all, one that is livable and one that does have good active transport and is sustainable. I do want to just acknowledge all the members of the team who've contributed to the work that I've presented. It's been a big team that is involved in this. If you're interested and want to sort of see what we've done, there's a report that's available, Creating Livable Cities in Australia. It just might provide some aspiration for you to think about what you could be doing in Hong Kong. And I would just want to point out that, you know, it's all very well having these data and having them sitting on your computer in an office and going to a conference and presenting, but we wanted to get it out there to make the data available for people. So what we've created is the Australian Urban Observatory, which can be accessed for free at a local government area level, but for a fee at a sub-LGA level. And what that does is provide the data, all the livability indicators, these and many more, that can be used by local government to look at where are the inequities in cities and how can they be addressed. Again, something that might be of interest to you, not because you can use this particularly, but because you might be able to replicate something like this in Hong Kong. So thank you.
Thank you, Billie. Definitely, we would like to invite you to Hong Kong, and also we'd like to go to Melbourne to learn from you later on when we can do the travel. But before that, I think, you know, there are a lot that we can learn from you in this panel. And so let me introduce our other panelists who are joining us at BEC. So to my left, we have Roger Torino, Associate Planner of OTC Limited. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you for having me.
And next to Roger is Mr. Patrick Fung, CEO of Clean Air Network. Welcome, Patrick.
Hello, Simon.
Thank you for coming. And we still have Bronwen and Billie joining us online. And we also have another gentleman, a friend of BEC, Mr. Nicholas Brooke. Nick is now wearing a different hat. He is Asia Pacific Chairman of the Urban Land Institute. But previously, of course, Nick has been very active with the Harbourfront Commission and other, you know, government advisory positions. So welcome, Nick, to join this panel.
Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe I will start with Roger. Roger, can you tell us a little bit about your company, OTC? Because I know you've been doing a lot of work on walkability, and in particular, can you share with us how important public space actually is in you know, enhancing walkability? Because I think, you know, I think Bronwen and Billie, you didn't talk a lot about public space and the connection with walking, but I'm sure you all agree with me that's an important component of good walkability. So Roger, please.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank Billie and Bronwen because I thought your presentations were highly complimentary and very timely for, you know, the times we have at hand, but also for the longer term visions and taking advantage of this period, which is a crisis on one hand, but creates a lot of possibility for the future. Regarding my company, OTC Limited, we're a consultancy based here in Hong Kong, and we work with a variety of clients. They can be public sector, private sector, or NGOs. And we work with them on the planning and optimization of transport terminals that can be across the entire range from airports and rail stations all the way down to metro stations, bus terminals, etc. Anything related to transportation. What I just spoke were motorized modes, but we also put the users, especially pedestrians, at the heart of what we do in terms of how we plan the facility, and it's always centered on the passengers. So when you ask the question about how does the space play a role in walkability, it's the, you know, the number one factor, because like a lot of people have alluded to in the presentations, Hong Kong is in a really special place. And I'm particularly talking about our Hong Kong projects because we have projects here locally, but also around the world. But Hong Kong itself poses a different kind of challenge because of the density and intensity of uses. But at the same time, it's also a blessing in a way because we're already, given the bones of a really robust pedestrian environment. Not to say that it's perfect, there's many, many problems, but we already have good material to work with. It's just how do you organize the space and how do you allocate the space? That's the key because that decision making is a reflection of your priorities and values. And I think that's one of the points that Bronwen had made when she was talking about the experience of COVID all around the world. There are all these initiatives that have been bubbling up over time and have been being pushed, but the introduction of this pandemic has really accelerated a lot of things. It's interesting in a way, actually, when you think about it, because in that sense, Hong Kong, for better or worse, because the virus situation is under control relative to the rest of the world, we aren't being confronted with a lot of these questions about how do we rethink the allocation and distribution of the space and how do we reconceptualize what those spaces do for us, what they can do, compared to how they're already being used today. And in that sense, Hong Kong, I hate to say, has lost that opportunity, but the conditions of the pandemic has been such that we aren't being confronted with those questions. If you just look out on the street, if you had given a before and after photo of the street environment, Hong Kong, it looks very similar. There's maybe a slightly less detectable, lower flow of traffic, but for the most part, the changes have not been as drastic here, except for maybe in the early days.
Well, thank you, Roger. My take is, I think Hong Kong people, we've taken for granted that we walk and we have the infrastructure and to allow us to walk, and the environment as well. And it's like walking is in our DNA because basically we're using a lot of public transport, and in that process, for the first and last mile, most of us actually have to walk. But and as you said, because of that, because it comes so natural, we haven't really think about, okay, with COVID-19, can we do more? Can we do better? And maybe that's the reason why it seems like the before and after comparison has very little difference. Mm-hmm. But I don't see that as a disadvantage. I feel like we in Hong Kong have started at a fairly good position because, as I said, everyone is a walker. And with that, then it's just a matter of how to beef up the infrastructure, the mentality, the understanding, and to improve the walking environment. And probably that would help Hong Kong people to walk more. I'd like to ask Bronwen and maybe also Billie whether you agree with that observation. Maybe Bronwen first.
Thank you, Simon. I do agree with that completely because what we discovered in this, the study that we've been doing, people only walk for the first and last mile. They don't actually spend any longer than necessary walking in Hong Kong. They walk, it's built into the environment, so you do it without actually having to think about it or to choose. And that is an effective mechanism for enabling physical activity. But if the environment doesn't have the quality that it needs, then it won't sort of invite people to walk further or at other times, and potentially reduce some of the congestion on the MRT and on the public transport services. So what we've seen in Hong Kong with the study and with coming for the conference, you have the urban fabric that Billie's talking about. You have the density, you have the proximity of services, you have the network of public transport, you have those things in place. But it's the quality that we see. We see so many compromises to pedestrian movement outside of that sort of the heart of the city. And so you see anti-pedestrian barriers, even in the middle of town. You get lots of pedestrian barriers, you get lots of surfaces, you get lots of off-ramps and on-ramps to road infrastructure that interfere with the pedestrian experience. And so across the city, the challenge is quality, and to invite people to spend longer walking or to choose to walk further as a choice rather than as a necessity.
Thank you, Bronwen. Billie, would you like to add anything?
No, but I think the same thing applies in terms of taking it to the next level and in terms of quality of the built form, is that how can you then identify where are the winners and losers across the city? Where is there enough green space? Is there enough tree canopy? All those things. You can actually map all of that, and you could look at then where are so it's applying that we've got a much more significant problem. You have great bones, and in fact, sometimes when you've got such a dense environment with lots of destinations, you don't need to walk that far. So you could actually might limit people's walking. But I think what's really important is to think about whatever the policies are, that where they could be spatially located and where there is inequity in the city. And I know on the fringe of the city cities that you do have some issues, then that's where you can use the mapping to actually show those and to identify where the interventions are best placed. So that would be what I would offer.
Thank you, Billie. Now, Bronwen, you talk about the walking environment, and that's perhaps, a real challenge and maybe, a weakness in Hong Kong, and that we should improve. And I think a lot of that comes from the city planning and transport planning. And in the first session this morning, we talk about, planning for vehicles rather than planning for people, and we have to change that mentality. Now, with that, I would like to pose my next question to Nick, because I know you've been, working, you've been basically spearheading the Harbourfront Commission for many years. And when we look at the waterfront in Hong Kong, it's like a precious asset. But then in terms of accessibility, there's a lot to be improved. And when you look at other overseas examples, actually, there are cases where they are doing much, much better. So Nick, can you share with us, other examples where you think the balance between vehicles and people are, planned in a much better way, and what are the reasons why they can do that? Nick, thank you.
Simon, happy to do so, but just before I do, can I just echo what the ladies were saying, support what the ladies were saying? I think in Hong Kong, we walk for convenience. We don't walk for the quality of the experience. So what we have to do is obviously improve the quality of the experience. And I'm sure we can talk more about that. But yes, I'm happy to talk about other examples. We've had some very good examples already today of what's been achieved in other cities. But first, could I just congratulate you on this very relevant and topical event. COVID, we know, has been very disruptive. It's created havoc across the region, across many economies. But again, as we've heard today, it's created opportunity with a particular focus on health and wellness and life balance. So I think today, is all about seizing that opportunity. Just a bit of background. At ULI, our main objective is to contribute to the creation of sustainable and thriving communities and cities. And high on that agenda is creating healthy places through active mobility, the topic today, and by putting people first to establish a lively, more livable, more safe, these are the words that have been coming out today, more sustainable and healthier city. I'm pleased to say, and obviously this event demonstrates it, that active and shared mobility is gaining more prominence than ever before. And these new transport modes have the ability to facilitate the development of green and healthy cities, as we've heard earlier. It's very important, I think, and we can talk about allocation of financial resources and solid policy support, but that is obviously key to the way forward. And the way we share and connect our spaces can have a fundamental impact on our communities. What I say, and very often when I'm talking, is that our hearts can race quickly, either from stress caused by traffic congestion or from invigorating active mobility, and I know which one I would prefer. Just like BEC, ULI shares a common goal, which is to establish a sustainable mobility system, which again has been the subject today. And again, you were asking what are the benefits? Well, the benefits are diverse, clearly reduce congestion and stress, improve quality of the environment, healthier choices, and expanded development opportunities. And the aim and the objective, obviously, is to improve the health and the quality of life of the residents in a holistic and integrated way. through the use of alternative green modes of transport and new technologies. At ULI, we do undertake a number of studies on a regular basis, and active mobility is high on our agenda, and we've demonstrated on a number of occasions that urban mobility is integral to city living. We have three categories of cities. We have those that are established, if you like, where there's a strong culture of active mobility, and I'm afraid we don't have those cities yet in this part of the world. I mean, Copenhagen and Atlanta are head of the league at the moment. Trending, those that are highly committed and already put in place policies and necessary infrastructure development. And we do have a number of candidates here in Asia, Seoul, Shanghai, Singapore, Tokyo, and Taipei. And then emerging, as we describe them, those that recognize the urgency of sustainability in the context of urban development and recognize the need to avoid negative effects of car dependency in the future. I won't spend time on Copenhagen and Atlanta. They're well-known examples, but they can demonstrate through measurement, through health measurement, through saving in carbon, etc., the benefits of urban mobility. What I just wanted to talk a little bit about is three examples. Shanghai, where they embarked on a strategy and a policy which might be described as humanizing the streets. And that all came about because of the domination of the car, if you like, in Shanghai. Between 2009 and 2014, motor vehicle mileage doubled, but in particular, the city's ownership of cars, can you imagine, exceeded 10% of the national car population. So 10% of the car population were in Shanghai, and they totally dominated the 12,000 kilometers of road space. So Shanghai, so that was a challenge. What did they embark on by way of solution? And what I'll do is focus on solutions as I'm talking about the three cities. They created a mission to return the streets to the people. And clearly that is one of the keys to success. And they embarked on a strategy of making the streets safe, green, vigorous, and smart. That was the name of the strategy and the policy and the banner that went with it. And they developed a set of urban development guidelines. So you do need the traffic lines, if you like, to help you take the thing forward. And interesting, this sparked a shift in focus away from engineering and road traffic towards the design of spaces and the environment. And artistic and cultural attractions were set up to encourage walking, while smart technologies were used to improve the monitoring and integration of public street facilities. So set about it in a meaningful way and led by government. What did they achieve? Well, the spaces in Shanghai certainly are now more interactive, they're more accessible, they're more aesthetic. And by downplaying vehicle transport, the streets were very much safer and more convenient to walk and cycle. And community life and leisure activities have flourished, and neighborhoods have become much cleaner and greener. And in my view, the takeaway, I think, is Shanghai got the fundamentals right by reviewing traffic planning and street design, and then fine-tuning it in a way that favored the pedestrian, the cyclist, and the public transit user. They widened the walkways, so they became common ground for people and for public-private collaborations to bring life and personality to the streets. So Shanghai, I think, is a good case study and something that Hong Kong can usefully use. Taipei as well. The challenge in Taipei was that 1 million motorcyclists used to commute from New Taipei to Taipei daily. And very hazardous if you were a walker or on a bike or a walker, high risk situation. And they therefore decided to address this. They wanted to create a world-class cycling environment and a public bike sharing scheme, and they created U-Bike. Many of you may have heard of that. That was developed in 2011. And the idea was to create something that would compete with the motorbikes, and they created parking spaces for bicycles, and they also dedicated spaces for walking and cycling. And real-time traffic and U-Bike data was made public, so that at any one time the users could predict U-Bikes usage and availability. So a real strategy there to deal with the biking situation. It's done very well in terms of takeaways. 50% of the cyclists are now women, which is very interesting. And already they've achieved a 12% modal share for bicycles within the city. So measurable success, and U-bike stations are within 10 minutes walk of most places in the city. So achieve the objective, again, drive and focus from leadership, sustained effort to understand the evolving behavior of the community, and creating the necessary infrastructure to bring it about. And they've obviously created a wealth of data on which the city can capitalize in further improving its systems and planning decisions. And then just finally, Singapore, where we described the strategy as leaving cars behind. Singapore obviously faces similar challenges to Hong Kong in terms of limited land and a dense population. So they've obviously shifted to more space efficient modes of transport. And there we're seeing the adoption of PMDs in a major way, personal mobility devices, which affect our folding bikes and other forms of similar mobility. And they're now allowed on trains and buses all day. And there are also numerous bike sharing services as well. So they're using that as the way of diversifying the mix, if you like. One particular thing that I thought I'd highlight, and we might talk about this, is in Singapore now, property developers, when they submit a development application, are required to submit a walking and a cycling plan. Now, wouldn't that be great in Hong Kong? Certainly for major schemes, if that was required, they had to take into account people in their planning. Results are very measurable in Singapore. PMD use is very high. And those who own a device use it regularly to travel to the office. So I think, again, Singapore takeaway, focusing on people's needs and working with the market to find mutually beneficial solutions, and creating mobility as a service, if you like, as something going forward. So Simon, those are just some thoughts, some results of work we've done. I think just echoing what some of the things that have been said earlier, I mean, I think our two ladies have done us proud. I mean, the material that they produce is very relevant, I think. What did I take away? Invest, have big ambition targets, look at localization of movement, and try and create low traffic neighborhoods. So a lot of takeaways, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I will come back to you later and ask you about the business perspective on walking, okay? Now, I'd like to turn to Patrick. Patrick, so you're running a clean air network, and literally, your organization focused mainly on improving air quality, and of course, then connected to public health. Now, I know Ken started to, also work on transportation issues, in particular walking and walkability. Can you tell us why? What's the connection? And what are you working on right now?
Thank you, Simon, and thanks for the speakers sharing. I think for today, it really tied up with the recent discussion about the policy address. So we heard quite a lot of policy advancement on multiple areas, especially on the environment side. So we have the leader of China talking about carbon neutrality 2060. We have Hong Kong talking about carbon neutrality 2050. And how are we going to plan towards that? And on that circumstances, I think Ken is in a position to really line up or as a translator on different disciplines. So I think air pollution or air quality is just an indicator of the overall well-being of the city. It connects to emission control. It connects to transport, especially transport demand management, especially on how we are going to deal with the new economy and new commuting pattern after COVID. And also it deals with urban planning as well. So I think these are the multiple disciplines that have been in constant conversation in the past 10 years or so. What we do want to see is that there will be a overarching or a coherent vision and goals that are shared among multiple disciplines as well as the government bureaus and departments, so that we will see some of the improvement on various sides. So for walkability, the walkability study has been conducted for 30 months from now. I think it really is the time for the public to know more about Hong Kong's government view on how to measure the success that we have been discussed and expressed by other speakers as well. And don't waste the crisis. So I mean the COVID crisis. And that is a time that we could think about a paradigm shift. It's not just a banner, but how we're going to, again, share vision among bureaus and departments among the government. And secondly, I think we do have to go local. As mentioned, we talk about local economic development, and a lot of people do walk within 10 to 15 minutes, the last mile, first mile, and it's about the living surroundings more than ever. So it is a time to really look at the context of the people and how we could tap into different diversity across culture, art, creative, to put people in the center of whatever we're making now. And the third thing is about to go for quick wins. And I think for quite some time, Cleaner Network has been working to try to pedestrianize or improve pedestrian environment in the CBD of Central District, especially the Devoro Central, as well as other districts, say Sham Shui Po. Both districts have been selected by the walkability study team of the government as a pilot site. So that is a good sign. And just last week, I think I've been to one of the schools area in Sham Shui Po, that there is a trial of the play street concept around one of the zones with multiple primary and kindergarten area. So what I found is that over the past couple months, people are so stressful, working from home, stay indoor. They need that mentality space and physical space to go outdoor. And it is, I think it's so much relevant to the topic we are having, not just this session, but the whole, series of today.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Now, you talk about the government study and you talk about success. Can I ask you, and actually I would like to ask the same question around the panel, how would you measure success or how would you consider success in terms of improving the walking environment in Hong Kong? Maybe I will start with Patrick.
Thank you. For me, the environmental impact is a must. So we're talking about how to measure reduction of air pollution due to more walk, and it's always a chicken and egg issue. Hong Kong people do walk a lot, but in a not inviting environment. We want them to have a better experience, and that leads to the second success is how we could measure the happiness among the Hong Kong citizens. I think that is how we could really trigger the participation of everyone on that topic. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, thank you. But the thing is, people have to connect walking and happiness, right? If you ask them, are you happy? Maybe they're happy because they earn a lot. But I think we need to translate and connect and get the buy-in that actually walking is an important part of their pleasant life and well-being. So maybe we need to do some education as well. But Roger, what about you? Would you like to focus on the use of space or anything that you can think of that leads to good walkability?
I think that was a good point when people brought up the idea of happiness. And I think when it comes to walkability, it relates to time and how we have the opportunity to reallocate the precious little time that we have. If we can improve commuting times, and when I say commuting times, it's for the majority of people who are not living in the central areas where a lot of focus seems to be. But if we can improve walkability and access to transport via active transport or motorized transport, if you can reduce commuting times, what that does is it allows people to have more time for other activities rather than dealing with the drudgery of commuting. And I think if you can maximize that across the widest swath of the population as possible, then I think that could be a measure of success.
Okay, thank you, Roger. What about Billie? What do you think?
Well, I think what I would say is I like the idea of measuring the environmental impacts because the noise, the air pollution, because that's related to transport. So if you created a walkable environment that controlled traffic, it would actually, because now air quality is a major cause of ill health, chronic disease, respiratory problems, all those things. So these things are, and they're objective. I like things that you can objectively measure. You can put monitors around, you can inject them, especially when you've got the smart cities, you can actually start to put in sensors around to pick these things up. So I like the idea of doing that. I like the idea, if we are going to be trying to improve people's access to transport so they can reduce, see, often we focus around the commuting patterns, but don't see the upstream things that cause the commuting patterns. So I'd like to sort of see if the policies change, are we delivering that to everyone across the city, or is it just for some people that are getting it? And I think because that starts to, the WHO, the World Health Organization, talks about the hidden city. Who's not getting these things? Because that's where you get inequity. So I think, thinking about your policies, which of those are measurable, and then putting in place the benchmarking and monitoring over time so that you can track how you're doing it and making sure that it's walkable for all, not just walkable for some.
Well, thank you. That's a very good point. Basically, walking for all. Bronwen, you were nodding. So what's your thoughts?
Too many thoughts, of course, so much to say. I like the mention of happiness at our conferences over the years, but we've talked about measuring smiles, not miles. And when Billie says she likes objective measures, I'm still trying to work out how we objectively measure the smiles that we see. Yeah. And I endorse what I've been hearing from people. And I think one of the things that I really feel matters for Hong Kong around the quality of the walkable experience, we've heard some of those critical factors, which includes improving the air quality. And one of the big reasons I know in Hong Kong is temperature and heat. So we need to improve the greening of the city. And while we dedicate so much space to road infrastructure, which generates so much heat and so much air pollution in our cities and takes away space for trees, we are not going to win. I know air pollution is much broader than just what comes out of a tailpipe, but it's a good start for local air pollution. I think the other things that we could really see is measuring how much time people actually spend in public space. The architect Jan Gell always said, walking is not just about getting from A to B, it's about what you do in between time. It's about dwelling, it's about spending time in public space, as well as about movement. And at the moment, Hong Kong's got getting from A to B worked out, but not that spending time and measuring that time spent in public space. And I'd just like to comment on public space in the Hong Kong context as well. And one of the things is it's not just retail space. And I know that's a very big component of available space in Hong Kong, which is actually private space. But we must create public space where people can just spend time, whether it's by the harbour, which is only available to those that can access it. But we need to create more opportunities for people to spend time in public space without spending any money. So these would be some of the elements that I would like to add to that measure of quality of walkability in Hong Kong.
Yeah, thank you, Bronwen. You kind of reminded me the term, the new term, stayability. That's something, of course, new, but because that's important, that's something we need to measure. Whether individuals are willing to spend time at the same place doing different things. It's not like we do window shopping. Basically, you want to be there, and because of that, in terms of the amenities that needs to be provided, in terms of the environment that you want to create, I think it is an entirely different mentality compared to spaces where you actually want to achieve efficiency and speed. So I think that's a very different concept. Billie, do you have something to say? Mike, sorry, Nick.
Well, no, I was just thinking about I wasn't waving my hand for that reason.
Okay, that's fine. Nick.
Simon, I think, bringing it back to the local context, I think what I would do is I would embark on a series of pilots at local level, try and do one in each district, choose a low traffic area or a low traffic zone, if you like, so you're not fighting too much with the adverse situation. I would do it at ground level. I think the street experience is so important. I was in Tunmun the other day. Do you know there are 43 elevated walkways there? They're all boring. You need a navigating aid to find your way around. The solution isn't to take people up in the air, quite frankly. So, I want to create the experiences at street level. And I think if we try and do one in each district and show people how walking from one open space, if you like, to another open space, but also experiencing all the things along the way at street level, I think we could start to change people's mindset.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I think, Bron, correct me if I'm wrong, the Walkability Study commissioned by Transport Department, I think they've already selected 2 locations to do like a case study. One is Central, the other one I think is Samshui Pole. So do you know in terms of the progress where they are right now? Can you share?
I was worried you would ask me about this, Simon. And I did. I can't actually share on that. I'm sorry. But it's definitely, it's an interesting challenge. And about where you choose to put pilots, I'd like to comment on that more so than the specifics, because Nick said choose a low traffic zone. And I think that's important. But I think it's also important to choose a high impact zone. And it might be a high traffic zone, but choose something where you can really feel and measure the difference that you're making. And so whether that's around schools or in a local street or a local area where you can really measure the impact. There's no point doing it where it's just a little dead end street leading into a plaza or something like this. So we have to be, we have to give people the opportunity to understand how different and measurably different it is. And I think that's what COVID did. People suddenly, we've all seen those pictures of clean air and hearing birdsong. People understood that it could be different. But I think that lived experience and wading through the backlash, get past the pushback until you can measure the positivity and get past the minority loud voices that ask for something to be different, I think is really critical. And there's lots of good examples, around school streets, around shopping streets, that you could start to do this. And I would endorse Nick's comment about street level. We can't just evacuate the street of people movement and put them all up into the levels, because when people come down on the street, as they inevitably do, they're going to be there. And if we make it hostile, then it's counterproductive to the ambitions of making it all walkable.
Okay, thank you. Billie, I clearly saw your hand.
I was just going to say, I think on that score, one of the things that we've found with interventions is sometimes they're not delivered as intended. And it's really, so they don't work because they're not fully implemented. And I think when you're doing evaluation of interventions, it's really important to actually measure what gets delivered on the ground. Again, I come back to that because in our experience, things sometimes, people have a policy or they have an intervention and they don't fully deliver it. And as a result of that, you don't get the effects that you might see. We've found that when you do deliver, we've done work in evaluating government policy. The policy didn't appear to work, but when we drilled into it, the policy wasn't implemented. It was only partially implemented. It wasn't implemented as intended. And so as a result, but when it is implemented, it has an effect. So I would encourage you to sort of think about putting in and measuring what actually gets delivered. I know I keep on coming back to that, but it's really important to me because I see it all the time. And when you get a modest effect, you think it's the intervention's not work, but actually if you haven't got an intervention, a really good intervention, then that's a problem. The other thing I just I wonder whether, and it may or may not be with, such a humid environment, but the heat island effect that, is this an issue in Hong Kong if you don't have a lot of shade? And I wonder whether as one of your measures that could be something that could also easily be measured, especially I was thinking Patrick, that you could actually heat on. And there's been some really amazing studies that have been done in playgrounds. I know Australia is very hot. We don't have the humidity that you do, but children are being exposed to really very hot environments extraordinarily hot environments as we've gone into it with a changing climate. So that's something for you to consider. You need to consider if it's right for Hong Kong, but it's something that's a nice objective measure that you could actually incorporate too, particularly if you do have this aspiration for creating a greener city. It would really cool the city down, make it much more pleasant for walking.
Okay, thank you, Billie. Nick, are you aware of any study in Hong Kong regarding shades and heat waves and walking, or have you done anything at all with ULI in other cities?
We've not done any. ULI certainly done it in other cities, and those studies can be made available. There's no problem there. In fact, I mean, shade and heat is something. Going back to my life as the chairman of the Harbourfront Commission, I mean, obviously walking along the promenade is something we want to achieve. We want to create that as an experience. So, in that case, heat and shade, and obviously inclement weather, were all issues that we have to deal with. So, I think, certainly, as we build, as we go forward with our mobility agenda, we have to be conscious of the special characteristics, if you like, of Hong Kong in terms of heat, shade, and storms, typhoons, etc. So it's all got to be built in, I think, into the ultimate solution.
Okay, thank you. And to the two panelists here at the auditorium, do you have any knowledge about any study, or I mean, in your projects or in your initiatives, in your work, have you come across any clients who are asking for help in terms of some climate factors affecting the comfort level of pedestrians or people on the streets?
I could speak to a few of the projects that we do. I would say definitely within Hong Kong and Singapore, where we have a few of our projects, that heat, shade, and shelter from the elements are often taken into account, because oftentimes, especially if it's a private sector client like a developer, they want to make sure that they ensure let's say the walkability into and out of their development is comfortable enough and attractive enough so that it doesn't pose any barrier to the throughput of their operation. You can say that it's primarily driven by commercial purposes, which is often the case in Hong Kong, like was mentioned earlier, but oftentimes there's overlap and they're not mutually exclusive, these interests. But in the other cases, it's highly contextual. We have projects in Mexico City, for example, where the climate is actually relatively mild. So there you can still take into account things like solar heating and shade, but the degree to which you have to protect against heat and humidity is less of an issue. But I think this is a particular concern for many of our clients.
Okay, thank you. And Patrick?
I think it is a particular concern for urban old areas as well that needs retrofitting. And I think some academic in Hong Kong has done research on the air ventilation, the house circulation could be enhanced in a highly congested cityscape like Hong Kong. And air pollution and decarbonization has actually are highly correlated and in that sense. So I think it is something a research interest in the short future among Hong Kong academics to do more on this.
Okay, thank you. And talking about research, and I think earlier on, Billie also comments on evidence-based policy making. So I think obviously there's still a big role for academics and also researchers to play. Now, Roger, you talk about commercial purposes. And with that, Nick, I want to come back to you because you also have a background working with the private sector. Now, is there a business case to promote walking in Hong Kong? What do you think?
I think there's a strong business case to promote walking in Hong Kong. I mean, I think the development community have changed, if you like, in the sense that they recognize and realize now that their tenants, their users, their customers are looking for much more than they used to before. And they're looking, part of this is walkability, and part of it is convenience, and part of it is experience. So there is a commercial case that I think you can even demonstrate as a bottom line case now in terms of higher values and better rents. So I think the argument is there, and I think the more enlightened developers, if you like, are already accepting that. So I think there's not I don't think there's a problem making the business case to the private sector. I think carrying the community with us is perhaps more of a challenge, because often they see interventions such as we're talking about as inconvenient to their daily life, etc., interfering with their normal routine. So I think anything of this nature has got to be taken forward very carefully in terms of public engagement and the public sector. I think they're almost a bigger hurdle, if you like, than the private sector.
Okay, Nick, I kind of remember there's an example that some local residents actually complained about transport department moving away the bus stop to 50 meters, so that they have to walk an extra 50 meters to get onto the bus, without thinking about the wider environmental and other benefits. So I agree with you. That's a real challenge at the district level, dealing not just with the residents, but also some of the district councillors. Now, with that, Patrick, I know you work a lot with district councillors. Can you comment on whether they are supportive of improving walkability, or whether you think they are still kind of 50-50, not sure, really depending on what their voters say? What's your view?
We have been working with the district level, including district councillors, schools, local NGO, individuals for the last 5 to 6 years. And I think the district council sometimes really reflect the genuine concern of the individuals. So moving the bus stop is really something that a lot of people in Hong Kong, they oppose the thinking because they don't see the bigger benefit behind. And I do understand that a lot of people in that circumstances would really like to support the idea, because they heard about that. It's a global trend, and the main issue is really to rebalance the benefit of different road users on the road. So it's not just about district councils, but also how we could convince other road users, business, street shops, all types of people, different generations. They do have different road space needs. So I think it's really the time to look at it strategically, and then to work with the cities in different levels, not only district council, but basically with everyone to have some quick wins, a good trial, to go small, to go lean, and to get quick wins.
Okay, Bronwen, I noticed you want to say something, but actually it's about time for my last question, and actually I want to ask you that last question, and that is, if you have the chance to say something to convince the Hong Kong government to do more, what would you say? But before that, maybe, what's your comment?
So thanks, Simon. I wanted to pick up on this moving the bus stop 50 meters, because of course, in this context, it's like, well, 50 meters, it's not very far. But if that 50 meters is hot, dusty, smelly, in the blazing sun with roaring traffic beside you, and you have to cross a road without adequate time at the traffic lights, or there's no drop curbs for your buggy, or, the pavement isn't wide enough, then that 50 meters matters. But if that 50 meters is clean and comfortable and things, then people will notice that difference less if the quality of the walk is better. And the other thing around bus stops is we did a project in Dublin, and they were looking at trying to put bike lanes in on an access route, and they kept saying, well, this is a problem bus stop here and this is a problem bus stop there. And I said, well, have you reviewed where the bus stops are, and maybe we could adjust them? And they said, we can't move the bus stops because of all these reasons, like what we're talking about. But studies in Germany show that you can have bus stops a bit further apart if you have a more reliable travel time, and if you have a more frequent level of service. People are more willing to travel the distance. So if you combine good walkability with a good level of service, then these distances might be more flexible, both in people's minds and in the reality. Coming to your question, if I had a chance to say to the government something to convince them to invest more in walkability, I've had a bit of practice over the last couple of years, certainly, and we did at the conference as well. We found very receptive government to the approach needed and to the changes that were needed, because the reality is you can't keep building car infrastructure for an increasing population. So when you hear stories about Shanghai, and I think the language was humanizing the streets, well, they're rehumanizing the streets. They've gone around the arc. They've realized that it's not going to work just to invest in motorization all the time. And they've come back to human scale urban fabrics, which is where we started originally as people, and where our communities and our urban fabric started. We've gone through this warp of motorization, and we've come back to this. And this is the work we're doing in Africa, is trying to avoid some of that motorization warp to come back. And so Hong Kong is now on that point. You can't keep investing. You can't waste money on overscaled infrastructure to move too few people in private motor vehicles. So walking gives you the quality of life, the amenity that you want for your city, and the serviceability that you want for your city, so that it's efficient and attractive for people to continue to choose to want to come and live, and to not get those ripple out effects around, impacts on health, mental health, and things. So the economic impacts are not just about business, but about the costs of the public and community, individual health as well. So it's not whether it's a nice thing to have. The imperative is that it's an essential thing to enable us to grow sustainably into the future, address the climate change. And I see it as like, we can't afford to create any new problems. We have to take all the opportunity for multidimensional solutions. So we can't answer a problem with only one option. Our answers have to answer climate, they have to answer air quality, they have to answer public health, they have to answer road safety, they have to answer quality of life. And walkability does that. I'm biased perhaps, but the evidence is also there, and that's what we have to invest in. And I see Hong Kong going in that direction.
Okay, thank you, Bronwen. I think this is a very fitting remark to end this panel. Now, thank you again, Bronwen, Billie, Nick, Roger, and Patrick for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, to close this session and the conference, I would like to invite BEC Chairman, Mr. Richard Lancaster, to deliver his closing remarks. Richard, please.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I'm somebody that always likes to look for the silver lining in every cloud. And one of the benefits that we've had of COVID has been an opportunity to run our EnviroSeries Conference online. And that's enabled us to get a very diverse and very interesting, fascinating group of speakers together today from all over the world. And that internationalism, I think, has really enriched the discussion today. I'm always amazed at our EnviroSeries conferences, just how complex and how rich the discussions become around sustainability and environmental issues. I have to be honest, urban transport is not my area, but I just found the discussion today to be so interesting and really bringing to light a complete rethink in the way that we tackle urban transport. It really is intimately linked with the planning of cities. We cannot just separate urban transport from the entire way a city works. And to me, it was great to hear terms about not just sustainable cities, not just low carbon cities, but livable cities, healthy cities, active cities, and happy cities. We, in the past, have designed our cities really around the transportation needs. We've built roads for cars, we have public spaces for people, and the two have been very, very segregated. Now we're thinking very differently about integrating the whole aspect of movability in cities and rethinking the use of our spaces, which I find not only fascinating, but really leading to a better quality of life in our cities. We've seen rapid advances in technology. We've got much more data available at our fingertips now than we've ever had in the past. And putting that data to use and thinking about how people use their cities, measuring how people want to get around, where they want to spend their time and how they want to move around is a real opportunity. And linking the data with technology developments in smart cities is a fantastic opportunity for us. And when I talk about opportunities, we are at BEC a business council. We like to get people excited about the environment and excited about sustainability. And what I've heard today are just so many opportunities for us to think. As the business community, we do have a role in leading change. And with so many opportunities, I cannot think of a more exciting opportunity than making our city here, Hong Kong, happier, healthier, and more active. So I'll close by saying a very big thank you to all of our speakers. A thank you to our sponsors as well. Without your support, we cannot hold these EnviroSeries conferences and make them as rich and interesting as they have been today. So thank you very much for your continued support. Thank you to the BEC team for putting on not only a fascinating conference today, but a very well-run event. It's our first online EnviroSeries conference and may well set a pattern for the future. So a big thank you to all of you. And lastly, but importantly, all of the participants today, all of you who participated online, thank you again for your support. And I wish you a good weekend, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.